is a special report.
Knowing how to invest your money is harder than ever before. Dealing with stock market volatility, record debt, and terrorist attacks requires new thinking. At U.S. Asset Management, we can help you see the world more clearly so that you can move beyond the chaos and invest with confidence. Call us, visit us online, or drop by our office. U.S. Asset Management, helping you make better decisions with your money.
So one of the areas we're very interested in, and President Trump is very interested in, is Canada. And we have the guy who knows it all, Robert Kraychik, good friend of mine, former reporter with Rebel News and Breitbart as well. Am I correct, Robert?
That's right.
So, wow, thank you for coming on. Always a wealth of information, as I said. I wanted to get you on. We talked last week because I saw what the premier of Alberta put out, and I was just fascinated. It was almost like a declaration of independence for the province against Ottawa, where they're just milking Alberta for all the money. So what say you, my friend?
Yeah, when you sent that to me, by the way, knows it all, that's a bit of an overstatement, but I'll take it. Appreciate the kind words. I was kind of blown away myself because I didn't think Danielle Smith had that sort of gumption in her. And, she's setting a list of demands for what she expects from the future government. This does tap into what your audience may or may not be familiar with. There is this sort of seed of desire for independence in Alberta. Alberta has some unique cultural characteristics in a political sense. It's a bit more religious in a Christian evangelical sense. Some other sorts of, I guess we can call them sects, like Amish types who live there, Mennonites, religious Christians. And that makes it somewhat unique relative to the majority of other provinces and territories. And there's also more of, let's say, freedom-minded, liberty-minded, you can use the word conservative-minded culture within that province that has always fed into this, let's say, undercurrent desire for independence that has some analog to what we've seen in Quebec.
Yeah, interesting. I want to play that video real quick and just let people hear what we're talking about. Hold on, let me bring it up 1 second.
The provinces have the right to own and develop their resources, and we own 85% of the oil and gas resources in our province. And I've just sort of shown you the number of reserves that we have. But what we've always done is just partnered with companies to produce it, and then we just take a royalty, and we haven't really thought much about where it goes to. And so we are thinking about where it goes to now. So we have a European refinery that has signed an MOU with us to take 50,000.
Well, that wasn't the video that I was talking about. Sorry, I brought up the wrong one. It was more of a where she was talking about how she's just not going to accept the essentially stealing of money of Alberta's resources to fund liberal agendas in the rest of Canada.
Okay, it's still a great video. I'll tell you why, because you reminded me of something. And we spoke about this last time. A lot of Alberta's wealth comes from the oil under the ground. And you know that in Canada, there is a lot of subscription among the political elites to this narrative of climate change, this massive artificial synthetic enterprise that is manufactured in order to extract and parasitize energy development and exploitation. So you would think if there was a government that was sensible in terms of desiring to spread prosperity, both in Alberta and across the country, it would seek to exploit those resources and allow easy transport, because Alberta obviously is landlocked to the west coast, to the east coast, to get to the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, respectively, and most importantly, to our dear beloved neighbors to the south. We've obviously got some of that going on, but that could be amplified. And you folks probably remember the same problem exists in the US with, so-called Democrat Party. I'm sure many Republicans are in on this too, this scam of this, climate change storyline. We've got to save you, give us all your money, we'll protect you from doomsday.
I'll destroy your economy while you do it.
Of course. And if you want to play ball, you got to pay us through these carbon credits, this sort of nonsense. Remember the Keystone XL pipeline that was shut down by the Biden administration, obviously whoever was handling him. And imagine how much wealth that just destroyed at the stroke of an auto pen.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, and lots of jobs day one, which really freaked out, it contributed greatly to our employment problem here, at least for Americans. The immigrants are getting all the jobs. But so the polling in Canada, I mean, they're showing, that this alleged, I guess, uprising against Trump's comments, which I'm sure caused, consternation among the Canadian public. But what's the truth? I mean, what's the feeling with Joe Bag of Donuts on the ground in Canada right now? I've asked you this before, but after the last week or two, what's going on?
Okay, like many, I am skeptical of the polls, and to quote Thomas Sowell, I've never been called by a pollster, and I'm 42, by the way, and I'm obsessed with politics.
Yeah.
So I'm wary over what they're saying. Apparently, the so-called Liberal Party has some small percentage point advantage over the so-called Conservative Party in this country. This seems like narrative building in anticipation of the scheduled election, which is, I think, late April. That's going to be our federal election. And as far as the, Joe on the street, what he's thinking, look, a lot of people that I know, they share my point of view that this is not this sort of belligerent aggression from President Donald Trump. There is reason to do this, to implement these tariffs on Canadian exports to the U.S., because for many decades, the Canadian government has been very hostile towards American business and commercial interests. And you can make that simpler. It's just hostility towards Americans, because flesh and blood human beings known as Americans are impacted negatively by our protectionist policies. So just to make it very, very simple, without going into too much detail, the Canadian government entirely restricts U.S. companies, and also foreign companies from any country, of entering our telecommunications marketplace. That's internet, that's cell phones. Also, there's massive protectionism for the egg and dairy industries, and that's obviously going to impact people in the northern U.S. states, whether it's Maine or Vermont. I think is very well known for its cheese and dairy. We also we completely exclude foreign competitors from entering our airline business. There are some other examples of that too. And of course, the Canadian consumer is impacted negatively by that as well, because when you protect ossified oligarchies or monopolies, it's the rest of us that pay more and get less.
And, we mentioned before, I used to work for CIBC, and I noticed that there's a lot of protectionism for the banks, and
Right.
Talk about monopolies. I mean, CIBC made horrible decisions, and they would, like, I remember when, or was it TD that came into the US, or I don't
TD.
remember, but it all blew up. And I know TD's still here, but I remember that there were other banks coming in here, and it just didn't work well when I was at CIBC, and it was just horrible decision making. But they're fine with it because they get taken care of by the government, right? I mean, it's just bail them out or whatever.
I can't believe I forgot that. It's a great reminder. It's a massive industry that is also benefiting from protectionism. American banking competitors cannot enter into the Canadian marketplace and offer financial products and services.
Yeah. So that always just fascinated me. I'm like, wow, I know what it was. It was the purchase of Oppenheimer, I think, by CIBC is what it was. And then it was just a massive cluster. So what about Carney? What do you think of him?
Okay, I'll get that in 1 second. I just want to add one thing to your point here.
Sure.
I just want the audience to understand that Donald Trump is aware of all these things that you and I are discussing. He knows that American companies are kept out of Canada in many ways and are punished in many ways through protectionist policies. And this tariff imposition is not coming from nowhere. One last thing, and this is arguably the biggest thing because it relates to what we've seen from Donald Trump towards NATO, these European states. Canada essentially freeloads off of implicit U.S. security guarantees. There is this trust, justified or otherwise, that the United States will protect Canada from military threats given our shared geography. And that knowledge, that trust, again, misplaced or otherwise, allows the Canadian government to spend less and less and less than would otherwise be required for military and security, and therefore further subsidize our corrupt welfare state. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, on Mark Carney, who is that guy? Nobody's ever heard of him? That's right. He's out of nowhere. And it's totally like Kamala Harris style scam in that, again, nobody's heard of Mark Carney. He's not an elected member of parliament. Member of parliament is our equivalent of a congressman or congresswoman, a House representative. It's the lower legislature that get elected in that position. So we've had several prime ministers in the past who were very short-lived, who were not elected members of parliament, but that doesn't make it okay just because it's happened in the past. It's very aberrant. And it shows you how, just as we saw in the US with respect to, supposed President Joe Biden resigning, that ridiculous post that was put on X, aka Twitter. And then there was no challenge. There was no democratic process through which the so-called Democrat Party would select a new candidate to run for the next election. So out of nowhere, just Kamala Harris got thrown in there. And here we've got a prime minister, former at this point, Justin Trudeau, resigning. And then there's this new installation of a prime minister that nobody's heard of and that doesn't sit in the House of Commons. So it's very, very unusual. But from what I've learned about him so far, I've done some reading on him. I was doing some research in preparation for this show. He's basically a professional activist at a very high level. He was former governor of the Bank of England. More importantly, he was the so-called UN. So-called, he's one of these, he's got a very good pedigree in the political elite sense. Went to Harvard, I think went to some Cambridge, Oxford, I think it was. So he's one of those, one of those types. He's had fake jobs all along. He was special UN envoy over the United Nations.
It's kind of the Ursula von der Leyen stick.
Exactly. So he's very invested professionally in the manufactured industry of climate change and that extractive parasitic operation. So I was watching a video of him just from a few years ago, just about an hour before we got on together, and he's speaking about limited time to save the planet, and speaking about how he's all in that. So again, I can go on and on with this guy. One more thing I'll share with you, just gives indication of the type of man he is. I use that word loosely. His daughter, who I think is now 23 or 24, she lives in Brooklyn. Shocker. He and his wife, who, by the way, his wife is also a professional activist. She's all about so-called climate change. That's her whole pedigree. She's just jumped from so-called charity to so-called charity, this type of woman.
The NGO scam.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Getting paid tons of money, just, advising for so-called policy to governments to help destroy human lives.
Right.
And he sent his daughter to this so-called transgender clinic in the UK back when he used to live there. Jeez. And this is the type of clinic that, preys upon children who are very young. So I think she was 12 or 13 when she was first sent there. And you know how that is. They do so-called counseling, so-called therapy. You know what that means. They're trying to indoctrinate the child. God forbid it would have gone. Yeah. I think it was called Tavistock. This was great reporting done by some of my colleagues over at Juno News. And this so-called transgender clinic was shut down by the UK government not that long ago as part of its sort of review of the so-called efficacy or legitimacy of these grotesque so-called medical practices.
Wow. So I want to take a quick break. You can stay for one more segment, right? Be right back. Sure. Thanks.
It's News from the Edge. It's Output with John Ritchie and L. Todd Wood.
You woke up with a sore throat and a low-grade fever. You know you are getting sick, so here's your choices. You can get sicker and miss work, try to see a doctor this week, or sit hours in a crowded waiting room at urgent care.
I have a smarter option for you. Open your medical emergency kit. Match your symptoms to doctor-recommended prescription in your booklet and take the right meds now and get well faster.
This is not a first aid kit. It's like having an urgent care in your home. It includes doctor-prescribed medications to treat over 39 medical issues like respiratory infections, strep throat, pneumonia, UTIs, and more.
No waiting to see the doctor and no standing in line at the pharmacy. It's right here.
Every home should have at least one medical emergency kit, and here's how to order.
Order online fast and save $45. Your kit with prescriptions to treat common and life-saving illnesses is rushed to your door. Visit twc.health/CDM, promo code CDM. That's twc.health/CDM, promo code CDM.
This is a special report.
Knowing how to invest your money is harder than ever before. Dealing with stock market volatility, record debt, and terrorist attacks requires new thinking. At U.S. Asset Management, we can help you see the world more clearly so that you can move beyond the chaos and invest with confidence. Call us, visit us online, or drop by our office. U.S. Asset Management, helping you make better decisions with your money.
So, Robert, I'm with Robert Kraychik. He was formerly with Breitbart and Rebel News and now an independent journalist, friend of the show. Thanks for joining us, Robert. I read an article by Victor David Hanson. He did it on the Daily Signal, I think, and he was talking about the history of Canada's, you were talking about the military and the security guarantees, but in World War II, you were one of the largest armies in Normandy, and I remember when I was in the military, Canada helping us on projects around the world or whatever. It was a very tight military relationship. And I guess I'm getting to this. Canada seems to be not the Canada of Reagan years. It's more, in my view, infiltrated by the CCP and other bad actors. And you're seeing the consequence of that. I mean, what say you?
I agree with you. The same phenomena, progressive phenomena, and I don't mean that necessarily politically in a joking sense, because there's an inertia, there's a trajectory and momentum to all things in life, including degradation. So as the country embarks upon these different types of policies that undermine the foundations that made it great to begin with, whether it relates to demographic cohesion, whether it relates to the maintenance of meritocratic standards, whether it's a strong subscription to the Christian ethos that built the Anglosphere, whether it was some degree of restrained government in terms of not getting excessively bloated and parasitic and corrupt. We can go on and on. The same afflictions that are hurting the United States and the rest of the English-speaking countries, it's happening to Canada. It's just a bit more advanced here than it would be otherwise down south, for several reasons. I'll just point to our weaker constitution. Our constitution does not have the same strong language, shall not be infringed. Every single so-called right that is consecrated in our constitution has a caveat allowing it to be limited for reasonable purposes. Right. So you can, that's a little hole that you can drive a Mack truck through eventually in terms of legalities. So I agree with you. It's not the Canada of old. And there was a time in which Canada's military obviously punched above its weight class. And the tales of heroism, bravery, risk-taking accomplishment are out there for anyone who wants to read about the military history of this country, all the way even including it's probably beyond World War II, but World War II is probably the last major conflict in which Canada had a very sort of righteous military history.
So
Afghanistan too, but it was already degrading at that point.
I was talking earlier. I'm getting a lot of comments from Reagan Republicans, if you will, that era of people who worked hard in the GOP to get Reagan elected and still think it's 1988, and they don't understand the mean tweets, the 51st state comments, the bullying that Trump is doing. I think it's more of a psyop in the art of the deal stuff that Trump's doing against the infiltrated government in Canada and trying to, make them cause them to make a mistake or something. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Look, from what I understand about Donald Trump, I actually think he's a very sweet man. I think this, let's say, belligerent persona, this boisterousness that he puts in the public is very much a show. And if you do research into the man in terms of things he does behind the scenes, he's a very soft-hearted man, very kind man. And I don't think he's got any sort of hostility towards this country at all. Perhaps certain leaders who do terrible things.
Yeah.
But I don't think Donald Trump would be hostile towards a fair arrangement. He talks about fairness. He spoke about that with NATO. I mentioned earlier that Canada is in many ways freeloading off of American military security guarantees, implicit or otherwise. So Donald Trump says it all the time. He's been saying it for decades. Back when he was with Oprah on her show, I think that was the 80s also, was talking about how the country, America, allows itself to be ripped off by its so-called allies, and he just wants things to be fair. So that's my impression of the man, and I don't think he's asking for anything that's unwarranted.
Yeah, I agree. What about this new conservative leader? I'll put air quotes around that. What are your thoughts about him, and what is he really? Because people, we get narratives here in the U.S. Oh, Canada's conservative leader is coming. Well, is he really a conservative?
My impression of Pierre Poilievre is that he's capable but restrained. And my suspicion is that what's happened to him is what happens to many people in his position. They become bubbled. They live in this hyper-political downtown Ottawa world where you're surrounded by people that are not at all reflective of, let's call them, average Canadians. The types of people that go into politics and obsess with it are not people that think in terms of honesty and ethics. They're not people that have any real experience in material life. They're very cerebral and abstract in a terrible way. They're the kinds of people that make a professional life out of going from so-called NGO to so-called charity to so-called nonprofit. So if you're living in that hyper-political world, let's call it the counterpart of DC, our swamp up here in the north, you can begin to think that the majority of Canadians actually want to be able to sexually mutilate their children with this transgender operation. You can actually come to think that a majority of Canadians really think driving their cars is boiling the oceans and melting the planet. You can come to believe that maybe majority of Canadians do think that white people are blue-eyed devils that want to drink the blood of non-white children. You can start believing this nonsense that you'll see from CBC and CNN and National Post and Global News and Washington Post. You know what I'm saying? The usual suspects. So I think that's afflicted Poilievre's mind because it's a very difficult job. It's very, at least, time demanding to be the leader of the so-called Conservative Party. And how much time does he really have to speak to? I consider myself very normal. Do you think he speaks to people? You think people like me exist in the House of Commons? No, we're kept very far away. You think people like me exist at the CBC? Obviously not. And any of us that do, and we don't, we know to keep our mouths shut, because if we say one word about reality, we're booted. Well, so I think that's happened to him.
You bring up a good point. I know some people in that world, that NGO, that nonprofit world, and I think deep down they know that they're not being honest with themselves and that they're doing something which is nefarious. But when you confront them, or even like let a little, pull up the cover a little bit and let a little light of truth in their lives, they run from it. I mean, they cannot, because that destroys their whole narrative of their life. If you say to someone working in a nonprofit, well, you're really working off someone else's money, I mean, that just does, they cannot accept that. I mean, do you see that in Canada? Like the scales are on and they will not let any light get through?
I've definitely seen that. I've seen even worse. I think fear is now the dominant cultural phenomenon in Canada and the broader English-speaking West. That is what defines most people's behaviors. That is what explains the widespread wearing of the mask and, accepting these safe and effective injections, so-called. And that's what allows parents to watch their daughter get beat up by a boy in some combat sport or some physical sport like rugby or football. It's this fear. What if I say the emperor has no clothes? What will happen to me? So the worst example I'll give you is that I'll be in a private setting with some person, my home, somewhere else, and they're speaking to me as if they're government managers right over their shoulder. Right? They can't detach and realize that, hey, you know what? You can take the costume off. It's not 9 to 5. You're not in the government office anymore. We're at the gym. Okay. We're in a restaurant. You're not being monitored. But they seem to be unable to turn it off. They're so afraid that someone might overhear them that they keep up this charade of language. Like, oh yeah, the planet is melting. Oh yeah, gender is complicated, whatever that even means,
I was speaking to someone who is in that vein, and I asked them something which they didn't have an answer for, and they said, I'll get back to you. I have to go find the correct language on that, which means they have to go ask their handlers, what should I say to this? I'm sure their handlers have a pre-approved script, but I found that fascinating. It's just a lack of critical thinking, but I have to go find the right language. Fascinating. What about Greenland? What do Canadians think about the whole Greenland thing going on?
You mean Trump's call to absorb it?
Yeah.
There's this manufactured hysteria around threats to Canadian sovereignty that have been projected onto the whole Greenland thing. And I'm talking about a synthetic manufactured narrative coming from the usual suspects in the so-called mainstream media, in which that's just another example. Look, Trump wants to take Greenland. That means that he's really, really serious about making Canada 51st state.
Right.
And even though I think Trump is perhaps open to that in some ways, it's obvious that Trump is not demanding that Canada sort of become absorbed by the U.S. So it's only used insofar as it's done to reinforce this over-exaggerated threat to Canadian sovereignty from Donald Trump. And by the way, this connects to something very important. I should have mentioned this earlier. The 2025 federal election in Canada is already being framed in a certain way from the usual suspects, in which it's a campaign against Trump. So Mark Carney is messaging. Yeah. Okay. So he's now the Emmanuel Goldstein of our year.
Mhm.
And he's this outsider, so he can't really be dealt with. So that gives a degree of permanence, which our political elite loves. They love permanent, unresolvable, or manufactured problems or ghosts or demons because they can fight and chase that ghost forever. And in pursuit of that quest or fight or whatever, they endlessly centralize their power and control over the rest of us for our own good, of course, and take more and more money that they can invest in fighting that ghost or phantom. So
Yeah.
Donald Trump is now centralized. And here's where Pierre Poilievre is very much failing. He's falling into that. Again, I think it's because of his logistical reality. He doesn't speak to normal people. He lives in a sick world of hyper-political, demented people. And he's also adding to his campaign, oh, I'm the guy to take on Donald Trump. I'm the strongest. He puts his chest out. I'll fight Trump harder than anyone. And that's not a reasonable way to approach Trump's legitimate, grounded grievances with the Canadian government.
I wonder if it would help him politically or anyone politically if they just came out and said, look, there's obviously a problem here. We need to work with the Americans and build a safe North America and prosperous and make us all rich.
Absolutely.
I mean, would that take off in Canada, do you think, or would it just be destroyed?
How could it not? Look, maybe I'm naive, okay? Ernest Hemingway said the truth has a certain ring to it. I believe the truth shall set you free. Who could disagree with that? Who could disagree with a deeper degree of economic cooperation between Canada and the United States built on freedom, built on economic liberty, in which people, how could you, no one could stand against that. So it's one of these, to me, 99-1 issues. And it's an obvious thing. But again, if you're living in this bubble, if you're in the eye of the storm, all you can see around you is mist and water and danger. If you step out of the storm, maybe a kilometer out, 10 kilometers out, you can see, hey, man, go a little bit this way and you're in clear waters. I don't think Pierre Poilievre can see that because he lives in this sea of wickedness and delusion.
So, Robert, thanks for coming back. I know your computer died, but I was just asking you, I mean, what is diet and health, a focus on health, done for your life? I mean, you've had a change, right?
Yeah, it's been life-changing. It really is the center of my day. I'm actually so glad you asked that question. By the way, your audience can tell that we're bros if you can ask that sort of intimate question about health issues.
Exactly.
So I got diagnosed with ulcerative colitis when I was 22. That was 2004, okay? And I have what's graded as a moderate to severe case of it. So I've had severe instances. Initially, the long story is this. So the short version of the long story is this. Initially, I was very defeated. I sort of bought into this medically established faux orthodoxy that it's this genetic thing and it's independent of how you live your lifestyle. Your only solution, if there is one, is medication, and if the medication dies, you can always get drastic surgery in which they give you a colectomy. They would have removed my colon and given me a colostomy bag. Imagine that. Like, I was 22 years old. Who's going to accept that? What kind of girl is going to go on a date with you in that situation? Oh, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So thank God I am stubborn and obstinate because I did not really fully listen to them, but I still surrendered much to the disease for about 10 years. I was very much degrading and declining. Eventually got to a point where I was in really dire straits. I
remember that.
Yeah, I was facing a surgery. I was facing some degree of surgery, and it was my own negligence that brought me there. That awareness that it was perhaps not my fault, but definitely my problem, helped me restore a degree of agency and control and discipline and sense of open-mindedness towards discovery and experimentation, exploration. So I just began to study as much as I could. And by the way, I did have a little bit of a, let's say, amateur pedigree with this. I was a gym bro when I was a kid. I used to be young and fresh. I loved working out. I loved eating healthfully as I understood it at that time, although my understanding has evolved a lot. Yeah. So I just think that people need to take ownership because as our medical systems, and I use that word plural deliberately, even though we have different problems, we have a lot of shared common catastrophes with our so-called healthcare systems. There are many faux orthodoxies out there, a lot of faux dogmas, a lot of centralized control, which is related to corrupted financial interests from different companies and different government interests. So, the whole trust your doctor disclaimer refrain that we endlessly hear 50 times a day is often terrible advice because you should not reflexively issue out trust to any physician based on either competence or ethics without screening them and using your judgment. Don't just look at the MD and be like, and by the way, one funny thing, a great friend of mine said this to me. that disclaimer that we've all heard, this is not medical advice, trust your doctor, always do everything with a doctor, don't do anything without a doctor, that right there gives away the game. Because if doctors really sit atop this hierarchy of knowledge in the modern society, as they pretend that they do, there would be no need for that disclaimer. Every single American, every single Canadian, without being told, would know that doctors are the best. They're ethical, they're the best educated people out there. There's no even close second place. But the fact that everyone knows internally that in many cases they're incompetent, they're corrupt, they're slaves of a wasteful, evil system.
Protocols.
Yeah, that's why you've got to have that legal disclaimer. Go to the doctor, because if you weren't told over and over and over, you wouldn't do it because you would know better. Anyway, that's a short version, but bottom line is, took ownership. I'm in a much better place now. I'm certainly not out of the woods, but my disease is now, I consider it the chaperone on my shoulder. If you remember the I Love Lucy episodes, there was like a devil Lucy and an angel Lucy. The devil Lucy is telling her to do bad things. The angel Lucy telling her to do good things. I consider my ulcerative colitis disease, that's my angel. So when I'm facing decisions every day, if I want to make the right choice, the angel's telling me, go to sleep on time, eat that healthy food, abstain from that booze or the drugs, don't watch too much TV, this sort of, get outside, go to the gym. The angel is my guide. It's my personal trainer, so to speak.
Fantastic. You know, on that note, my mother just passed, and she was in the hospital, and her kidneys were failing. And it was, and this isn't, I'm not degrading the hospital or the people who are working. It's just their training and their system. But they were saying, well, you know, she's going to come out of it. We're going to put her on this drug and that drug. And meanwhile, her body was getting more and more toxic because her kidneys weren't working. And I was asking, you know, what about, isn't there some other reason? You know, maybe it's their kidneys. And they actually kind of got irritated in the emergency room, you know, in the ICU. And eventually that's what she passed from. They tried to put her on dialysis, but it was too late. So I feel like that's exactly right. You can't be your own doctor, but you have to feel empowered to ask questions and to do your own research and to know what the hell you're talking about. We have this thing called the internet now, and you can do a lot of, and they don't like that. They don't like Dr. Google. You know, they don't like you knowing more. Anyway, any final thoughts?
Well, I'm very sorry for your loss. My condolences. There's no question that there is a hostility towards self-education. This is why they want to institutionalize everything. And this is why there was actually a campaign during the COVID-19 enterprise apparatus, this operation. They were mocking that exact phrase, do your research, was put in quotes with mockery from geniuses like Don Lemon, right? Brainiacs like Chris Cuomo.
Yeah.
You know, we should totally defer to guys like that, super high IQ, super ethical, super educated, right? Yeah, no thanks. So
hey, Robert, thanks, man. We'll have you back down the road. Really love your insight and enjoy talking to you. So I'm sure our audience enjoyed it too. Thank you, man. Take
Likewise,
care.
back at you. Cheers, Todd.
Right. Ciao.